Did you want to spend a bit of time, Chris, looking at some of these
Yeah.
comments?
Yes, I'm trying to think how we best do that. I'm just trying to think, there's probably about three or four different ones to maybe touch on, and we may have answered some of it. So I don't know how we best do it, but I think that would be a good
Why don't you
idea.
kick
Yeah.
off, and then I've got some comments as
Yeah.
well from my YouTube.
Okay. Yeah, so Sheila Hall was talking about she was talking about this idea. I'm not actually familiar with this, so you might be able to help me around it. Um, she was saying something about within pluralism, this idea of active congruence and active UPR, which are terms the active bit I'm not so sure about. And she was kind of curious about how would we both kind of represent these conditions? How would they look in the counselling room? So I don't know if you can say a bit about the active bit as a start, and then we can see where we go from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a way of understanding what there's different ways of understanding. If we take something like UPR,
Yeah.
positive regard. Um, I think there's a way of understanding it as a kind of non-judgmental acceptance.
Mm,
Like I am not going to put a judgment on anything you say.
mm,
That can be quite potentially quite passive, can be
mm,
quite kind of sit back, kind of,
mm,
I'm not gonna condemn you, but I'm
mm.
also not gonna kind of prize or affirm or kind of
Okay.
validate. It's a kind of,
Mm,
it's a stance of being person-centered. I guess I'd describe it as more kind of sitting back. And I think in probably from a pluralistic standpoint,
mm,
we wouldn't say certainly the positive regard always has to have a more kind of active face
mm,
to it. But I think we would say that for some clients, that may be more receptive element, way of being
mm,
unconditionally accepting.
mm.
That clients maybe sometimes need more, want to see that more explicitly.
Sure.
And that
Yeah.
might be in the form of pricing, active pricing.
Mm,
That
mm.
might be in the form of, validating what clients have done, really
Yeah.
encouraging clients. That might also
Mm,
be in the form of kind of conveying warmth and conveying kind of
mm.
positive pricing. Client talks about, and they're doing something, and we can join with them in kind of celebrating what they've done.
Yeah.
I think from a classical stance, which was very much based around non-directivity,
Mm,
one might be quite wary about that kind of more active, kind of particularly
mm,
prizing.
mm.
You don't want to kind of positively affirm things because it kind of conveys a negative affirming. Whereas I think in
Right.
pluralism, we probably hold that different clients need different things at different points in time.
Mm, mm.
Some clients do really value that kind of sitting and just being with in quite a quiet way. For some clients, kind of active affirming and prizing
Right.
is there.
Yeah.
I suspect that, person-centered therapists would probably, might say that both of those forms are, really
Mm,
valid. Some might
mm,
tend more to
mm,
one, more to the other. I guess
mm.
it comes back to how we understand what person-centered is. And then what would you say,
Mm.
Chris?
Yeah, I think the thing that stands out for me in that is going back to, I think we spoke about it in the second video, is this idea of intention. And I think that is maybe how I would kind of evaluate it for myself in terms of person-centered practice. So, like, where is this prizing coming from, for example? Like, is it something that I'm wanting to do to the client? Is it like a congruent expression of something that I'm experiencing in relation to them? So for me, that might be like a slight difference in how we practice those potentially, is that I think you're saying something about weighing up what might be most helpful for the client. And for me, it might come more of like how I might congruently express or communicate these things. How are they best received, I guess, by the client? I think that might be a slight difference.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I was thinking that it would be helpful for a client to feel validated by me by something they've
Mm,
described,
mm,
that
yeah,
I would go into a more kind of active validation. Whereas I
sure.
guess what you're saying is that you might be more cautious or wary about that because
Yeah,
your X is based on the core conditions, my Z is based on more this question of what is helpful for the client.
yeah, and also how do we assess that? Which actually I haven't done this on purpose, but this is another question, so I might go into that. Is Jess was saying about like how do we define what is helpful and like whose frame of reference is
Yeah.
that? So does the therapist define what is helpful? Does the client define what is helpful?
I mean, I think obviously the client is a
Yeah.
question for the client, and I think the way that you identify that is through dialogue. So you talk to the client about what they'd like to get out of the therapy.
Yeah.
You talk to them as the therapeutic work proceeds about, what are they finding helpful and what they're not finding helpful.
Mm.
And a lot of the work I've done around preferences is very much around that's helpful. I
Mm.
mean, for me, without that explicit, or, not all clients want to talk about it or can talk about it, and not all clients
Mm.
know. But I think without trying to create that as collaborative, the danger is that you then assume and you work on certain
Mm.
assumptions about what is helpful that then become much more therapist centered. I
Right.
mean, I would kind of challenge a bit, like if we were going to, move on from the discussion about what is person-centered to what is helpful,
Mm.
I would say that, one of the problems with X is that it's kind of assuming what is going to be helpful.
Right.
And unless you're actually checking it out actively with clients, you don't
Mm.
know. You
Right.
don't know exactly. I guess you'd say, the intention of X is not to be helpful in the first place, so it's not an issue.
I don't know if I go that far because then we almost like go in a loop then because then it's like how are we defining helpful? So I don't know if I'd say that because ultimately we are there as a way to help, right? Like that is what
Well,
we
yeah,
do. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it is about how we define that. And I guess something I was thinking about before today actually was this idea, like in person centered, around this definition of like a process conception of psychotherapy, that it is about the process. And I was wondering about if that is the difference in being helpful, that maybe pluralism might be described as something like I don't know, solution or goal conception of
Now,
psychotherapy.
Chris, do you mean when you say pluralism,
I
do
keep
you
getting
say
mixed up with this. I
pluralistic philosophy or
apologize.
practice? Because
Practice,
they're different, and
practice.
I think, yeah, pluralistic
Yeah,
practice. Yeah.
I do keep doing that. You're right. I'm glad you said, yeah, practice. Yeah.
Sorry, say that again. So you're saying that in the
Yeah.
pluralistic practice,
So if that might be a more of like a goal or solution conception or focus of practice, and that might be the difference with person-centered is this like process conception of psychotherapy in a sense. And you could argue the process is in order to be helpful, however you define that. And again, we're in the loop. But again, I think that might be an important distinction about the
yeah.
conception of what we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that that's because pluralism tries to be pluralism. Now I'm doing it. Pluralism as a practice
Mm,
and as a philosophy
right,
um, is trying to be as client-centered as possible,
right.
and that the reason it doesn't start with a process conception is because it would see that as a kind of therapist-based assumption that
Mm,
may be
yeah.
right for some clients, but actually not all clients are necessarily going to go through kind of Rogers. I mean, for you, and I agree with you. I think therapy ultimately we are trying to be helpful.
Mm.
So how would you define what is helpful?
Yeah, let me think about this. I guess it is based on the belief of X in a sense and what I can do most helpfully. Because when someone is having therapy with me, it's about how I can be of best help. And that unfortunately is based on what I can do most congruently, if that makes sense. So it is, I guess what I'm saying in that is it does become a kind of subjective thing in that way, if that makes sense. So, my personal belief is that to provide a space where, yeah, someone feels understood and accepted allows them, I think, a lot of the time to get to places that they maybe haven't done before, have greater understanding of themselves. I think it also allows them to be more authentic, which I think is a very important part of therapy often. And I do think that kind of ground, that facilitation is what best helps with that, I think, in my view. I don't know how clear that was, but that's
It is
how,
clear.
yeah.
I mean, I guess from a pluralistic standpoint, I think that is very clear, but I would say that I think there's a risk of if that becomes your assumption about what is going to help a client, for me,
Yeah.
that becomes therapist centered. And that's why
Mm,
pluralism tries to move towards to asking the client and exploring that with the client. But I think at the same time, Chris, that you're saying, and I think you would be clear about that, that is your assumption. You
mm,
would probably try and be clear, I
mm.
imagine, with clients about that you're not saying this
Absolutely.
is the truth, but this is
Yeah,
your way of working, which
absolutely.
saying, I think we both, going back, we both agree that X is a really powerful
mm,
effective way of working.
mm.
We agree on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so essential to be saying this is how I work and this is why, and it may not be a good fit for you. You
Yeah,
know, I think that's important. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Do you want to
Mm.
go on to, have you had other points or?
Um, I'm trying to think. There was one last one around from Martin was saying about this idea of what we've talked about a little bit, I suppose, about the development of the approach and this I kind of coherent with the values and the principles of the approach, and then how we almost assess that in evaluating it. I'm just trying to see if I can say that a bit clearer, almost like who defines the evolution of it and what are we measuring it against? You know, there have been modern developments, but how are we defining those or not as person-centered, which I think we've covered, but I'm just wondering if there's any more to say on that about.
Say a bit more, Chris. I'm struggling to get my head around that one.
I don't feel like I'm being very clear with it either. It's only because I have like brief notes on it and I'm just trying to kind of capture that quickly. So let me just try and capture that a bit better. Um, I think there's something about if we are making developments within the approach and we're calling it person centered, then how are we measuring those things or defining those things as person centered? Similar
Yeah,
to what we were saying before, like where
yeah.
does the definition come from? And is there a risk of this kind of reappropriation of person centered? I think Martin had said this in regards to a writing around pluralism, in order for it to be kind of paired with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have explored this question and very
Mm,
much what we mean by person-centered. And
yeah.
I think that really comes back to it. And
Mm,
yeah, I guess one of the, why, I mean, I think one overarching question for me, and maybe it comes on to something that I'll read out one of the comments that I've got, but,
mm,
why is there a lot of anger in the person-centered field towards pluralism?
right.
And I think it does come into people feeling that we're saying, if we take this X, people saying that maybe X is wrong, or it feels people are saying we're saying person-centered is Y, or in some way it
Mm,
feels
mm,
like we're kind of appropriating or invading
mm,
X and critiquing it and saying,
yeah.
and maybe, I think that's, but there's a lot of emotion there, and I think trying to
Mm.
understand that emotion would be good, maybe from another time.
Yes. Yeah, I guess one thing I want to go back to, I think it's from the second video, which I think touches on that point from you, is I suppose there is this question about do we need to involve person-centered in that, if that makes sense? And that might be then, in a sense, where the criticism comes both ways then, because it's almost like, hold on, what are you saying about this approach? And then there's a pushback, and then there's almost like a pushback on that the other way as well. In terms of like, is it risking, is there a risk in a way to the understanding of the approach or the approach by critiquing it or by including it within, say, pluralism, for example?
I think, yeah, and I think, where I struggle with that is when people say X is person-centered, everybody
Mm,
knows X is person-centered. If you think, that's the only way you can use this term. If you want to talk about something else, just call it something else,
yeah. Mm,
And that's where I kind of think, who gives you the right to say
right.
X is person-centered?
Right, who's defining it? Which I think goes back a bit as well to what Martin was saying there, is something about what do we do about definition?
Yeah,
And if people are saying this is or isn't something, then whose definition is that?
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that's where I come to, that's where I come to thinking that the fairest, the most
Mm.
humane, and the most person-centered, I was going to say pluralistic, but the most person-centered way
Mm.
is to say, look, we've all got our own definitions
Right,
and let that flourish.
right,
I just, I can't get with this thing about, it has to be this.
sure. Yeah.
But I do understand also, what you're saying about depth
Mm.
and the flourishing. And just to say, Chris, I mean, this is taking off on tangent, but just at a personal level, the word that always comes to my mind is this word miscegenation.
Mm.
And I think when people, and the other word that, Harry Potter, Death Eaters,
Right.
I
Not
don't
too
know if you
well.
watched Harry
Not
Potter,
too
but
familiar.
you have Harry Potter. Well, interestingly, with all J.K. Rowling, but Harry
Mm,
Potter is all about kind of purity versus miscegenation. It's the kind of it's the battle between the purists, the ones who say the purebloods,
mm,
and
mm,
the ones who are kind of the dirty bloods, the ones who
mm,
are kind of miscegenated, and and it's very personal for me because as a Jewish person, you
mm,
know, family who were murdered in the name of purity. Um,
mm, mm.
and I think that makes me very wary between of people who say, this is the only way of doing it,
Sure.
purity. I think that, we were talking a lot about in the last one about kind of allowing for, for me, Levinas, allowing for diversity. For me, it's an ethical thing, which I think, I would see in Rogers. I don't believe Rogers, and maybe I wouldn't, and who can put words into Rogers. I wouldn't have liked to believe Rogers was a purist who said this is what,
Right. Mm.
this is the only way of understanding it. I think Rogers would have valued diversity, would
Mm.
have wanted to welcome people.
Yeah.
But I understand what you're saying about fear of, maybe it's a tension. Maybe that's the reality. There's
Mm.
a tension. And you're
Yeah.
right, things can be dissolved into nothingness.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think, Rogers was saying that is didn't want this like loads of little Rogers just running around, to be exactly the same. It was kind of around evolution and kind of subjectivity, I guess you could say, in line with what we're saying as well. So yeah, I think that makes some
How do
sense.
you how do you balance a desire for welcoming with a desire for in-depth understanding and a desire
Mm,
for things to be practiced in a kind of specialist expertise
right.
way?
Mm. Do you mean like welcoming, say, welcoming people like to the approach, for example, and also have a depth under, is that what you mean?
No, I think more welcome
No.
difference.
Welcoming
Like
difference, yeah.
how do you find a balance or a synergy between
Mm,
welcoming difference,
mm,
really valuing the multiple different ways that people can see something,
yeah.
and at the same time holding on to I
Mm,
mean, yeah, purity.
yeah.
Purity is good as well. I mean, I like
Mm,
to say I have some personal association with purity, but
mm,
when you think about purity of a diamond or a purity of a metal,
mm,
there's also something amazingly rich. And I think if you lose that purity,
yeah.
you lose you lose something very rich and you
Mm,
lose potential.
yes, yeah. I think
And
that's
but
true.
maybe that's where we've got to, Chris, is like,
Mm,
how do
mm,
you balance those two things up? How do you,
yeah.
I think we both believe in the value of both of those things.
Yeah, yeah. And I think for me, there's something of, I think it maybe starts with that understanding that I was talking about, is that we understand the theory as best we can, we engage in it. And I think there's something in terms of how we engage with diversity about the more we understand and kind of see where we sit with it and feel fairly comfortable with that, I think the more secure we can be with diversity as well. I notice it in myself. Like if there's something that I feel I don't know well or I feel threatened by or something, there's much less chance for me
Yeah.
to be welcoming and open to diversity and engaging in that because I'm just focused on protecting myself. So if we can, I think, have a depth of understanding about the theory, make a decision for ourselves, and kind of be like, okay, this is where I'm at with it at the moment. I think that also frees us up to say, okay, what else is going on? What else are people saying? And I suppose, doing things like this, that we engage in it and we try and learn and hear from one another and kind of move in that
Yeah.
position too.
I mean, I think it has the potential. I'm not sure that's inherent, but I agree with you that that's a real
Mm,
potential. I was thinking, funny as you're talking, Chris, about like if we think about communities and like
mm,
how communities relate to other communities, like people from an ethnic minority community or like the Jewish community.
mm,
Um, there's something really important within a community about being open to other communities, being
right.
welcoming, being understanding, and
Mm,
listening deeply and understanding the position of different communities, but also holding on to, I mean, not purity, but it's like, as a Jewish person, I wouldn't want, I mean, I wouldn't want to lose what's special about being Jewish.
Sure.
I wouldn't want to lose that kind of history, that depth, that richness, the
Mm,
richness of
mm,
philosophy, the richness of the culture. I wouldn't want all the kind of bagels and chicken soup all to get just kind of miscegenated
mm,
into just kind of mass, non-distinctive nothingness.
mm.
So I do want to hold on to that distinctiveness, but also I would want to hold that attitude of welcoming.
Yeah. Yeah.
And but I think it's a tricky balance, and I think
Mm,
with communities that's always an issue, isn't it? It's often an issue about how you
absolutely.
do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And
And
I
I
guess for
agree with
me,
you.
yeah,
Mm,
and I think for me, pluralism is a model. I guess why I like pluralism, I find that it's a model of thinking about like pluralism isn't relativism. It isn't just about mushing everything together. It
mm,
is
mm,
about trying to hold difference and appreciating both the kind of the real specialist beauty. One of the things that, I mean, in the last book I did, Chris, on social change, psychology at the heart of social
mm,
change, and
mm,
one of the things I did, which was kind of bizarre, was do a kind of little fictional bit about,
mm,
what a good world might be based on kind of
mm,
therapeutic insights. And I was really clear when I was writing that kind of narrative bit that
mm,
that kind of specialization, that kind of people having their interests, people being able to really focus distinctively on things is just so core to a kind of
mm.
well-functioning society.
Right.
But being able
Mm,
to hold that in balance with other people's
mm.
kind of ways of doing things.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
for me,
That
that
makes
is
sense.
pluralism, that is
Yeah.
pluralism. I do believe in that.
No, I do get that. And I think, like you say, it can be a tricky balance in terms of that. But also, again, I think it goes back to intention. We can only start from this is what I would like to be the case. It might not be easy and there might be effort and kind of movement in that. But I guess that's the starting point is like, how would I like this to look? And ideally, that we hold some of our own and also welcome in at the same time.
Yeah.
Mm, yeah. I'm aware of time. I'm
Yeah.
also aware that I don't know if there's been much chance for your comments, so I don't know how we best do that
I mean, a
or
lot of them were really positive, and a lot of them were
mm,
saying that, there's really interesting stuff in the video, lots to, think about. I mean, and maybe
mhm.
people can go to the YouTube, but as you say, we're kind of
Yeah.
coming to the end of time.
Mm,
Some critical, which is
mhm,
interesting.
mm.
There's no such thing as non-directed therapy unless you're a dummy. I had this
Interesting.
argument 11 years ago in counselling
Mm,
training with many tutors.
yeah. That I did want to say something about that, not that comment specifically,
Yeah,
but about this idea of non-directivity, because I think one of the things that's often raised about non-directivity is that whatever response we give, we are being directive. And I can understand that in some respect, is that we are choosing what we say. But I think that does miss what is important about the attitude of non-directivity. So, of course, our words might be influential, or we're choosing which bits we respond to. But I think to dismiss it as say, well, whatever we say is directive, really misses the point of the importance of a non-directive attitude. And I just wanted to make that point because
yeah.
it came up last time, and I think it's really important distinction.
And also that there's a spectrum, isn't there? I mean,
Mm.
there's a risk that if you say, well, everything's directed, that you don't distinguish between somebody saying, kind of reflecting in a way that might subtly pick up on one thing rather than
Yeah,
another,
yeah,
versus somebody saying, you got to do this,
right, exactly, exactly.
there's degrees. Just the other one I want to pick up is,
Mm.
actually, sorry, these are both critical, but this one's
Mm.
critical. It says, I think Mick has a strange misconstrued view of what person-centered therapy is. It implies that a person-centered therapist is passive, dogmatically stuck and held back by rules, which does not put the client's well-being first. Firstly, he ignores the tremendous power that empathy and UPR can have for the client. For many or most, this is something special that they experience for the first time in therapy, and they
Mm.
find this curative in and of itself.
Mm.
This is putting the client's well-being first. Secondly, his beef with the person-centered approach seems that sitting and doggedly aiming to offer the client the core conditions, as he sees person-centered therapists to be doing, is all a person-centered therapist can do, and this is somehow not active. That a person-centered therapist can never challenge the client or offer a technique is, I believe, mistaken. The point
Mm.
is that a person-centered therapist fundamentally believes in and respects the client's actualizing tendency and autonomy and offers the conditions that have been shown to facilitate a relational environment for the client to work through their incongruencies. If this exists, many creative things can happen in therapy. That wasn't you, Chris, was it?
It wasn't me. It was. I replied underneath it though, actually, but it
Oh, did
wasn't
you? What
me.
did you say?
Yeah.
You said, I completely agree.
Yeah, I think that was what that person had commented had captured something of what I was trying to capture about the approach, about the potency of the approach and the kind of variety of ways that can look.
Yeah.
Yeah. What how does that land with you? What do you take from that, or how do
I
you
mean,
feel about
as we
that?
were saying, I believe deeply in the power of the approach. I think it can be an
Right.
incredibly powerful approach for lots of people, lots of the time. And
Mm.
I feel like I've said that so many times
Yeah.
that if
Yeah.
somebody's saying to me, me saying person-centered approach is rubbish,
Mm.
yeah, that feels like that's at some point it's just people not listening and
Right.
not kind of willfully not listening. I mean, I think, do I have a strange misconstrued view of what person-centered therapy is? Um, I think I've emphasized some of the things that I find difficult.
Yeah.
And I can see that, that I have sometimes spoke about that more than the many wonderful and beautiful things I think about it. I think I have, although,
Mm.
I wouldn't have edited a handbook of person-centered therapy 3 times if I didn't believe that,
Mm. Mm.
it's kind of an enormously powerful approach.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, I think sometimes, particularly in the debates around pluralism, sometimes it has focused more on what I see as a kind of dogmatic
Mm.
position. And
Right.
I think one of the questions that comes out of this is, is that prevalent?
Mm.
I think some people have really challenged and said, look, some people have said that's not there. Some people have said that's a real minority.
Mm.
Um, I guess it's an empirical question. I mean, I've experienced that. I think other people have
Yeah.
experienced it, and some of the comments other people have talked about
Sure.
that.
Yeah.
So it's there to some extent, I think. And I think it's also, I mean, the reality is, we did research, for instance, on, I think I mentioned last time on counselling in schools with these really good
Mm.
person-centered therapists. And in about a third of the cases, the client said they weren't active enough.
Mm.
That's not me. I certainly didn't want to find that. I wasn't looking for that. That was a empirical reality. And I think,
Mm.
if I was to say, well, that's just, it's easy, you can dismiss that. You can say, well, that wasn't them being person-centered then. But
Mm.
these were well-trained, adherence check more than anybody else, pretty much in any other
Right.
study person-centered therapists who are doing what as closely as possible has been defined as person-centered. And I
Mm.
think just to say, well, that's not person-centered therapy, there was something that a significant minority of the kids were wanting more. And I think
Yeah.
we have to take that seriously. And I feel
Mm.
sometimes, I've said, look, I think this is something we need to look at. And people have said, well, that's not person-centered, or,
Mm. Mm.
you're just stereotyping it. But, you know, that's what we found. That's what we
Yeah.
found. And for me to be person-centered is to be open to that and say, well, what can we learn from here?
Mm.
And I
Mm.
think some people, going back to thinking about kind of active positive regard, some people say, well, you know, what the person here is saying that there is a way of being person-centered, which is about being very active
Mm.
and which is about kind of using different things and that is about challenging, and if we want to call it, that's whether or not we call that person-centered. Certainly, I think that's
Sure.
kind of effective ways of doing therapy. But
Mm.
there are, and you said, Chris, you were saying exactly the same thing. There are people coming out thinking and practicing as
Mm.
person-centered in a way that we kind of wouldn't necessarily identify with
Mm.
or see. And that does happen. That does happen. People
Definitely.
call themselves person-centered, exactly what you're saying, and are actually maybe acting in quite kind of stereotypical ways,
Mm.
maybe not having that kind of depth of understanding of the approach.
Yeah.
That's happening as a community.
Mm.
We need to be addressing that. And I
Yeah.
think just to say, well, that's not person-centered, doesn't
Mm.
really address the problem.
Yeah, I get that. And I think that's another misconception is this idea of passivity. I think it is a very active approach if it's practiced well. So that is another thing that can often be attributed to it. I think, again, a kind of the ripples of a misunderstanding of the approach is that someone might practice with like, well, I just reflect what they said last and I just nod along. And then people have this image of person-centered being passive and so on and so on. And I guess that's why this is important to me in terms of how we define it and how it's practiced as well. But yeah, it's a difficult one because I guess one of the things I did read in that research as well was around this idea of silence. And I guess that that is a tricky one as well. You know, this idea of like with person-centered practitioners, the clients didn't like silence. And I think that can potentially be argued really about what is going on there. Are we saying that is person-centered? Are we saying actually the empathy is kind of present if they aren't picking up that discomfort? You know, it isn't just sitting. That might be another misunderstanding. We just sit in silence. Well, we just leave silence because that's what we've been taught. But I don't know if that one particularly is kind of negating person-centered or saying this is a person-centered practice, this is what the research found, and that is kind of specifically attributed to person-centered practice. I don't know.
Okay, so to discuss this a bit further, so it was a third of clients. So we found about a
Yes.
third of the young people to varying degrees,
Yeah.
and this is something we found consistently in the person-centered research on school counselling, said that they found the silences difficult. And
Yeah.
that ranged from people in a minority of cases who actually dropped out because of the silences,
Mm,
to people who said, there was loads of really great things. I love the person-centered. Maybe the silence was a little bit awkward at times,
mm,
but it wasn't a big issue for me. Now we found that in studies consistently with, I mean, in that study, it was with, as I say, very well-trained,
mm,
experienced person-centered therapists,
mm,
where the clinical lead was one of the kind of leading person-centered therapists in the UK and who was
mm.
doing the training. So I think to say, yeah, but okay, but they weren't person-centered, for me, that feels too easy.
I
We've
get
also
that.
done that, sorry, Chris. We've
Mm,
also found the same thing with people who I know are really good,
mm,
experienced practitioners,
mm,
person-centered, kind of other kind of related humanistic approaches. I think, I mean, my sense of what's happening is that the therapists are trying to be empathic, trying to really listen, trying to really engage, trying to give the
mm,
client space. But
mm.
sometimes clients do experience that as awkward, uncomfortable,
Of
not
course,
what
yeah.
they want. And I think we
Yeah.
need to listen to that and think about how does that help us? I mean, BACP have adapted their competencies for humanistic counselling as a result
Mm,
of those findings. And I
mm,
think, that seems to me very person-centered, that you listen to clients,
mm.
that you take that on board, you think about what we can do differently, and
Yeah.
we evolve.
Yeah, I agree with that. I guess for me, there's just something of I don't know if I attribute silence to person-centered. That's the first part, is like I don't know if that is a specific thing. And then secondly, I think it's about how we respond to that. So for me, I don't think I'm ever thinking as a practitioner, I should leave silence here, you know. So I guess I'm just wondering, yeah, I mean, we can get into another video here, but I just did want to raise it as well. Is like there's something about what are we saying about silence and how are we connecting that to person-centered? And then what are we also saying about how practitioners, maybe even across the board, respond to silence? You know, if I'm seeing a client that is, you know, I might be leaving space because I think they're going to talk, and then they're kind of looking around and looking uncomfortable. Like, I think I'm going to respond to that. It's not like I'm just going to sit there and say, well, you know, I've got to leave space here. So that's what comes up for me. But I
Yeah.
think we can go to a lot of layers on
I
that.
mean,
And
I
yeah.
mean, I think something similar has been found in psychodynamic therapy.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect probably not in the CBT.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe it is, I don't know. And, in
Mm-hmm.
CBT, I imagine young people, there's other issues that come up about,
Mm-hmm.
feeling, when you ask them what they don't like, probably stuff about, I didn't like the exercises. I think,
Mm-hmm.
pretty sure that that's there somewhere in the research. You know, that question about what does this say about see, I think sometimes people hear that
Mm-hmm.
as a criticism of person-centered.
Mm-hmm.
And that in some way, somebody somewhere, when I say a third of kids in our study said that to some extent they felt awkward with the silence
Mm-hmm.
when they were with person-centered therapists. I think I think people hear that as a criticism, as almost a
Mm-hmm.
kind of deliberate attack on the approach
Mm-hmm.
for being silent.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm genuinely not saying that. I'm saying that,
Yeah.
this is what we found with person-centered, with
I get that.
qualified, and I want to defend our therapists because I think they're really good
Sure.
therapists.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
With good qualified adherent person-centered therapists,
Mm,
this is what the kids said.
yeah.
And so what does it say? I don't think it's saying that person-centered therapists have to be silent or that
Mm,
characteristic the
mm,
approach, but it does tell us that in bona fide person-centered therapy, a
yeah.
third of the kids are saying to some extent they felt a bit awkward with silences. And I
Yes.
think if we turn around and just say, well, look, this is our model, this is what we
Mm,
do, that just,
mm.
that's why. So, my definition of person-centered, Z,
Yeah.
is that, person-centered means being responsive, means listening, means thinking about what's helpful to clients. And,
Mm,
we can get into an argument about is Z or is X more,
mm,
I don't know, more person-centered and more helpful. But I would, for me,
mm.
I would defend Z. This is where I say, well, actually, listening to clients, that's what is person-centered. I don't think saying, well, this is how I work, so stuff it is
I
person-centered.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, yeah, I understand what you're saying. Is like it's not like you've just created this, it's like that is what the findings have shown. Like you can't do anything about that. I suppose maybe I can put it better is like I'm curious what was going on with
Yeah,
silence in that
yeah,
practice. That's all I'm saying is like
yeah,
what was going on in that silence. It's not a well, forget that. It's more like, oh, that's interesting. And yeah, that's more what I'm
yeah.
saying.
I
Yeah.
totally agree with you, Chris. And we've done a little bit of research, and it'd be great to do more research. We got the
Mm,
recordings actually. So what
mm,
was happening in silences? What kind of
mm,
silence? Heidi Levitt has categorized different kinds of silences.
mm,
We could look
mm,
at the types of silences, and yeah, and
mm.
that's where I think we can learn and we can develop
Yeah,
and we can evolve the approach
absolutely.
and understand it more. But I think we have to do that with an open mind, with
Sure.
the idea that maybe we need to think about how we might modify a practice, and that goes back to the point I was making earlier that I think if we define our approach by a very specific set of practices, I think we limit ourselves in a bit of a way. Because what happens if the kids say, the silences came out, the therapist made these really empathic reflections, and that led to awkward silences. Well, maybe we need to think about empathy in a slightly different way, and I
Mm.
think it's good to have that flexibility.
Yeah,
But I'm
it's what
aware of the
research
time,
is there
Chris.
for. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We've
We
really gone
agree more than
into.
we disagree, don't we?
I think that I feel glad. I feel like more understood. I feel clearer on it. I feel like we've represented it well and kind of represented our crossover and our differences and covered a lot of ground. I think a lot of ground. So I'm really grateful.
Me too.
Yeah.
See you
All right.
soon. Part 4 at
Thanks,
some
mate.
point.
All right. Yeah, yeah. See you later.